Hello, class. Welcome to the presentation for Lesson 3, which I've titled Prelude to Collapse, Colonialism, and Imperialism. Whoops. Um, Today, we're going to talk about the third in a series of factors which led into the First World War. Consider this one of the most important. We talked about nationalism and its importance, and this is going to involve nationalism. None of these are mutually exclusive. Both nationalism, industrialization, and colonialism slash imperialism all kind of come baked in the same cake, and they are all perhaps equally as responsible for the collapse of Europe after um, the First World War and the further collapse after the Second World War. So we'll discuss. So here we have a meme. I didn't make it up. I don't know where it came from, so can't really attribute it. But what you're seeing here is the top. The areas in red were part of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, and the parts below is what the British Empire was after World War II, which is just Great Britain. Um, this kind of puts into perspective the rapid contraction of the empire through to almost apocalyptic wars. It shows the height of British control at the end of the 19th century. It doesn't show the total expanse of British control. I mean, clearly, the United States was a former British colony. There were other colonies which had, that by the end of the 19th century, devolved from Britain and become independent. But this gives you a pretty good idea as to how broad British control was. And this was imitated by other European powers. Certainly, the French controlled most of the area of West Africa. They also controlled most of Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And so we'll see how this control, this is just the British Empire. Here's an example of, here's a map of, it's titled here, it's from a textbook, as you can see below, The End of Empire in Africa and Asia, and roughly describes what we call the era of decolonization, largely in the global south, formerly called the Third World. Now we call it the global south because that's a more respectful term and a more accurate term. And if we look at this map, we can see in a little more detail the degree of European control that extended even after World War II and then somewhat beyond until it finally pretty much ended after the 1960s. If you look, some interesting things here are if you examine, for instance, French control, as I just mentioned, look at the French control of West Africa. All of these countries really, almost in a 5-year period, become independent. Also notice French control here in Southeast Asia. We'll talk more about that as we go further on in the course after World War II. We'll talk about the French Indochina wars, and then subsequently the Vietnam War, known as the Vietnam War in the United States, known as the American War in Vietnam. Also notice the chain of British colonies extending from Egypt to South Africa, known as colloquially as Cape to Cairo, which was the dream of the British Empire to control this area of Africa. Also notice, but that the real sort of crown jewel of the British Empire was this area of India, this area of the Indian subcontinent, excuse me, all of which became independent nations in a very chaotic and tragic way, in some cases, in the right after World War II. World War II ends in 1945, and you find here these independent states of 1947, 1948. That gives you an idea of how weak the British Empire had become, that it really, almost immediately after World War II, relinquishes control of these areas. It should also be noted some smaller countries, and we're going to talk about some of these smaller European nations. And I say smaller not because they're really smaller, but because of their particular influence in the colonial project at the end of the 19th century. They actually don't appear on this map. You do see Belgium here. Uh, um, the Belgian control of the Congo, we're going to talk about to some extent. You don't see Germany and Italy, and that's because this map is showing post World War II decolonization. And Germany, for instance, lost all of its African colonies after World War One. It was forced to give them up, and then they were inherited, or at least taken over by the British and to a lesser extent the French. So if you look at this map, this gives an even more dramatic rendering of what happens to Africa. And mind you, we're going to talk mainly about Africa today. Part about Southeast Asia and India is going to wait for future lessons and talking about those in relation to European history and contemporary Europe. We're going to concentrate on Africa in this period, and these maps pretty much show you why. One of the most dramatic aspects of European colonialism and imperialism takes place really over this almost unbelievably rapid period. If you look in 1880, this map of Africa shows all of the different kingdoms, principalities, and caliphates that existed in in Africa, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. You can see the sort of complexity of these areas in 1880. By 1913, at the dawn of World War One, the continent was almost entirely carved up by European powers. Now, the degree and extent of control of European powers of this vast continent, and it is vast, it's much bigger than you think, Africa. It's often shrunken on maps for a variety of different projection related reasons, and some people believe culturally insensitive and prejudicial reasons. But in any case, I'm not going to go into that right now. 1913, you see the extent of European control just in this 33-year period. Notice, because this was not on the last map, notice the areas of the German Empire here. We're going to talk about German East Africa, which is a very unusual and interesting case of European colonialism. Also because it doesn't really last past World War One, but it's instructive to actually understand to a certain extent Hitler's designs on other areas of Europe, as well as an overseas empire in the short-lived Third Reich between 1933 and 1945. So we're going to look at that to kind of get inside the head of what the Third Reich, what the Nazis wanted to create, and what their kind of expansionist, imperialist thinking involved. Because you're going to see a lot of preludes or a lot of hints of that before we get to it. Also notice in yellow here, Ethiopia being an independent nation as of 1913. That's going to be true. That's largely because they're going to be one of the only nations that is going to defeat a European colonial power during this period. They're going to defeat Italian incursions. Notice Italy's control around here, but Ethiopia, if you look at this list, aside from Liberia, the entire continent, aside from Liberia and Ethiopia, is essentially controlled by European powers. These are the only really two large-scale independent nations in Africa as of 1913. Of course, that's all going to change, as you can see from this map. So, let's go through the slides, and let's ask some questions as what fueled this colonialism? What were the reasons for it? What were the designs that European powers had, and what motivated them? First, we have to understand that this is not really the first wave of European conquest of overseas empires. Of course, if you look back, and we all know about the era of European conquest, first pretty much started by Spain and Portugal in South America, the Caribbean. Portugal also colonized, had large trading centers all around the Indian Ocean. in East Africa and beyond. Um, and then, of course, you have the English expansion into North America, French expansion around the world as well. So this is really not the first wave of that. This is a second wave. It's a very, very somewhat briefer wave, but it's a much more intense wave, and it's a wave really fueled by the new kind of technologies brought on by industrialization. So you had faster ships. You had not only had steamships. Now you're going to have ships made of metal. You're going to have guns that are much more powerful in defeating the native peoples that inhabited these areas. So this is going to be a much, much more rapid period of conquest, much more intense, and and tragically, in many ways, an extremely deleterious and deadly wave of conquest by Europeans. As I said, a lot of this was fueled by the Industrial Revolution, but it wasn't just fueled by the sort of creation of, say, weapons of war, which made it easier to defeat native peoples, or ships that could get places faster and extract raw materials, and bring them back to Europe. There was more to it than that. The Industrial Revolution also changed the way that business worked inside Europe. This also happened in the United States. So whenever we talk about this happening in Europe, a lot of this is also happening at the same time in the United States, but I'll concentrate on, we'll call it European, just for the ease of nomenclature. So the Industrial Revolution, in first in England and then elsewhere on the European continent, creates a situation in which rapidly the factories in Europe are producing more goods than the people in the particular countries that the factories are in can consume. So you have a you have a situation in which they're making so many goods that they have to sell them elsewhere, and we'll get to that in 1 second. Also, there is a because these factories are creating so many goods and creating um, so so many more products than they were before, those factories need or require or desire more resources, more raw materials from all over the planet. And so there becomes really a global demand for raw materials. One example of this, which we will see most tragically, is at the end of the 19th century, there is an intense demand for rubber. And that demand is fueled by tires for both bicycles and later automobiles. And rubber is the largest rubber plantations are going to be in Africa. And so, at least natural rubber, synthetic rubber comes later. So the demand for these resources creates the will in many of these European centers of power to colonize many of these areas to get those raw materials uh, very quickly. And so the Industrial Revolution is almost, you can almost see it as an engine, as a metaphor, because the engine just keeps whirring and keeps consuming and keeps needing more things, and then the engine keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and keeps sucking in all of these resources from around the world. So the Industrial Revolution creates this global demand for resources, and as these factories get bigger and there's more factories and more people move to cities and more people get employed by factories and more people consume the goods and population increases, and then there's almost a dependence on this. It just keeps skyrocketing. And as I said at the beginning, and I kind of preceded myself on this, there is a problem with once you create all of these products in a particular country or a particular region, that, and let me give you an example. I like to use shoes because shoes are easy to understand. If you lived in the 18th century, say in Germany or in France or elsewhere in Europe, you probably had one pair of shoes for quite a long time. You would take it to a cobbler. The cobbler would fix the shoes. You would have basically the same pair of shoes. You didn't have like a whole bunch of pairs of shoes. You basically had one, and you kept fixing it. It was just like basically a leather glove for your foot, or whatever it was made of. And so there was no real industry of shoes. Now, when factories begin in England in the late 19th century and excuse me, late 18th century and early 19th century, they're shoes can now be sort of churned off of these assembly lines. They can be created very, very fast. And clearly, if you have a shoe factory in a particular town, say a town of 5,000 people, and the shoe factory is putting out 10,000 pairs of shoes a day, or whatever the number is, there's not enough people in that town to consume them. The shoes go elsewhere. Soon, this one factory is creating shoes for thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and soon everybody's got shoes, right? I mean, maybe now everybody has 5 pairs of shoes, but I mean, the capacity of these factories to churn out these products far outstrips what people in the domestic market can consume. And so, what do you need? Well, you need places to send this excess product. You can shut down the factory. Excuse me. You could shut down the factory and stop making shoes, but then guess what? People are out of work. Factory lose money. You need more markets. You want markets outside of your domestic situation. And so first you trade around you with other, say, industrialized nations that are close by, and then eventually your capacity to make shoes outstrips any of that supply even, and then you look overseas and you want to send these products overseas somewhere to other markets to purchase. If a European nation can control another nation on another continent or another people on another continent and create a market for sending those shoes, for instance, and then also dominate that market such that they don't let in other European powers or other industrialized nations to sell their shoes there. So you can almost have a colony where you're exclusively selling your stuff and you're not letting in other stuff, or you're taxing stuff, you're putting tariffs. Then you can control that. So you want that, for instance, colony not only to extract the resources from, but also to sell, hopefully exclusively, the products that you make back in the factories in Europe. So this oversupply creates a problem. And then, of course, as I mentioned first, there's also military hardware that comes out of the Industrial Revolution. Because now you were able to make much more weaponry than before. You were able to temper that weaponry and make it in a much more rapid, it's much more powerful. And you can then send that weaponry to those colonies to subdue those colonies and create a relatively small force to control a large population of people through your superior military technology that you've created back in your factories. So you see how all of this, the Industrial Revolution, works to create the seeds of colonialism. Also, let's not forget nationalism. We talked about that in an earlier lesson, and we looked at German unification and Italian unification, and how nationalism sort of created these large states in Central Europe, which to a certain extent destabilized Europe. But the examples of them are interesting because they come late to the colonial game. Remember, they are rather, they are not unified until the 1860s and 1870s. At that point, other European powers, the French, the English, had gone elsewhere on the globe and had markets. Germany and Italy did not. And since they come late to the game and they're intensely nationalistic now because of their recent unification, they want those colonies quick. They want to get in this great game. They want to get into this competition for colonies with these other European powers. They see it as vital to their project. And in many ways, some of the that's why we're going to look, actually. We're going to look at Germany and Italy, and we're going to look at Germany and Italy, some of these smaller nations first, Germany, Italy, and Belgium in particular, to get a sense of Belgium too. Belgium has independence in basically around 1830, and they quickly tried to get into this project as well. Another example of nationalism, of course, I mean, it's a European history course, so I'm always kind of like, oh, we're going to bring in the United States. But the United States and Cuba is another example of this. At the end of the 19th century, the United States, which was a former colonial power, gains its independence in the late 18th century from England. And then by the late 19th century has really become such an industrial powerhouse that it too then becomes a colonial power itself. So we're going to see how it then go. Well, we're not going to see in this lesson, but for instance, at the end of the 19th century, just as Europe is having this scramble for Africa, the United States is scrambling to take over large portions of the Caribbean as well as the Philippines and Asia, access to Chinese markets. So you're going to have a similar thing that's going on with the United States. Um, so I said that we're going to concentrate on Africa. So I want to go back to a certain extent to we can't really understand how Europe is looking at the rest of the world without understanding the nature of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade, which extended roughly from the 1400s, when it was to a certain extent pioneered by Portugal, and then extended from 1400 until the late 19th century, was really, and there's really no other way of saying this, was really the engine which created European prosperity and dominance during that essentially 500-year period. Without the traffic in slaves, Europe does not see these kind of economies of scale in terms of profit that 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 they do. And now you look at this map. This is clearly, we know what this is. Hey, look at the triangle called the triangle trade. We've all been exposed at some point in the past to the notion of the triangle trade. And the triangle trade, the description gives you an idea of how Europe becomes so wealthy. Here's an example. The triangle trade can be seen as a process, but let's just take it as one ship, right? Say there's a ship, comes from the east coast of North America. This ship has raw materials from the colony of North America, and I'm doing this in the sort of American colonial example. It takes those raw materials across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Those raw materials and raw goods such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, etc., are then processed and created into other goods, sort of finished products, textiles, etc., manufactured goods in Europe, where they're beginning to where they make them into finished products. Those finished products are put back, say, on the same ship, put back on the same cargo ship. That cargo ship goes down to Africa, where many of those finished products are traded and or sold or bartered for people. People are then put onto the same cargo ship. The transatlantic slave trade did not use ferry boats or steamships. They used the same sailing cargo ships that were used to take the raw materials across the Atlantic and then these sort of finished goods down to Africa. And then they were offloaded and people were stuffed into these holds. And I'll just give a sort of monetary example, which is somewhat colloquial, but I've heard it before, is that say you would purchase a slave for, say, the equivalent of $25 in Africa, that and say you purchase, say, 100 slaves, we'll use a round number, for um, and put those slaves on for $2,500 and put them on the in the hold of this sailing vessel. The sailing vessel takes weeks and weeks to get across the ocean. Some of those slaves, a certain percentage, die en route. Those slaves are then offloaded, usually in the Caribbean or South America, but to some extent in North America. And at point of sale, that slave can go from being worth $25 in goods and or monies to being worth $150. So this is 6 times profit. Remember, that's 6 times profit on one leg of this voyage, because then that $150 is used to purchase raw materials. Those raw materials are taken back across the Atlantic Ocean. That $150 worth of raw materials is clearly sold at a profit here, right? Who knows? Let's say it's 6 times. Purchase something with, so 6 times, if it's 2,500 here, 15,000 here, say it's 6 times here, you're up to 90,000. 6 times here, you're getting the picture. 540,000. I mean, clearly it's not going to be six times everything. Ships sank, cargo gets lost. There's all sorts of problems, obviously. But if we just do a six times figure, which might be excessive, you're talking, you have $2,500, right? Am I doing this math right? $2,500 worth of slaves here turned into $15,000 worth of slaves here, turned into $90,000 worth of raw materials sold in Europe, and then etc. So you can see how this engine of profit is really whirring throughout the Atlantic, and this is going on for hundreds of years. Another thing to remember about the transatlantic slave trade and its centrality is that it's also central to how European nations begin to imagine themselves. If we look at this map's pretty good at showing the vast size of Africa in relation to Europe. When Europe starts to extract slaves from Africa in the 1400s, remember slavery is it's been around pretty much since the dawn of humankind, but the transatlantic slave trade is different because this is the first time that slaves are being brought so far away from their home. The children of slaves are still enslaved in the New World. You have an entire slave industry that depends on the eternal enslavement of a people. This enslavement mostly comes from the west coast of Africa largely because of geography. Europe needs slaves, needs non-Christian slaves, because the enslavement of Christians was effectively discouraged and or banned by popes in the 15th and 16th century. And so this is the closest area where there are no Christians. There are Muslims and there are African animists. There are people of many different belief systems, largely not Christian. And these areas are closest geographically to the place where you want to take the slaves, which is these huge plantations. So there's nowhere else. You're not going to go, for instance, to India to bring slaves to North and South America because that wouldn't make any sense. So, and the result of this is that while there's always been forms of slavery, there was slavery in the Roman Empire, there's slavery in nations all over the world, the particular nature of transatlantic slavery gets associated with Africa. And so slavery in the mind of the many century long period of the transatlantic slave trade becomes wholly associated with Africa and eventually becomes wholly associated with what we know as blackness or black people. That is something which develops over time. That is not something, the notion of race being connected to slavery and Africa being connected to slavery is a process. It is not a fixed idea as of the 1400s and 1500s. There's no thought that, slaves should come from Africa. That's just sort of part of the vagaries of the brutality of the transatlantic slave system. So race, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the idea of racism is something which develops over time in conjunction with the transatlantic slave trade. And so by the time of the 19th century, race and color has been associated with slavery. And this is how Europeans have now become, and Americans, and have started to think of slavery and think of the hierarchy of the world's peoples, which obviously I'm just using that term to describe the thought process. So we come to something called social Darwinism, and we have to understand that before the 18th century, many of these racism was somewhat of a folk idea. It's in the 19th century that these racial assumptions become tied to what Europeans like to think of as science. Let's see how this develops. We all know about Charles Darwin. We all know about his theory of evolution. Uh, this theory of evolution, just to briefly, Darwin travels travels the world. He goes to the Galapagos Islands. For instance, he sees these different types of finches you see in the lower left. He sees that they have different beaks depending upon which island in the archipelago that they come from. And he sees that they've adapted themselves. They've evolved over time. They've evolved different needs for different beaks, for the size of fruit or the etc. And so he has his theory of evolution that beings change over time as a result of this. Darwin never really said anything about humans, or he tried to discourage his thoughts about evolution from being applied to humans who are currently on the earth. He mostly thought that these processes took a very long time, and this was one of the great revolutions in European thought, great revolutions in human thought of the 19th century, was this idea that the earth wasn't, for instance, 5,000 years old. The earth was millions of years old, and this would allow this this development of different species to branch out from each other. Well, there's a philosopher, thinker named Herbert Spencer, and Herbert Spencer is really most famous for sort of projecting the idea of and coming up with the concept of what we call social Darwinism. So let's remember that Darwin is not a social Darwinist because he's talking about animals and he's talking about plants, he's talking about long periods of time. He doesn't really want to talk too much about humans. But Herbert Spencer does want to apply Darwinian theory to humanity. So let's look at the bottom right. It's Spencer who is responsible for the term survival of the fittest. Here we have his quote. This survival of the fittest, which I have here sought to express in mechanical terms, is that which Mr. Darwin has called natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. And you see how Spencer is putting this in a racial context. And what Spencer starts to do is to take Darwinian evolution and apply it to people. And of course, Spencer, being a Englishman, sitting atop the grandeur of the British Empire, sees the British Empire and the British people as the basically most highly evolved part of humanity. His justification is, well, look at the Industrial Revolution, look at our conquest, look at our empire, etc. And that this hierarchy, this social Darwinistic hierarchy, develops as a result of partially sort of gloms onto Darwinian scientific theory of evolution. If we look at this further, we see that Spencer and others start to assume that European civilization, the British Empire, other European empires, is, since it is at the quote unquote highest point of human development, and other races and peoples are in varying below that in whatever hierarchy is being concocted at the time, that civilization then, that European civilization, should be brought to these people in some ways. It should be that it's almost a moral imperative to be brought. Sometimes this is done through missionaries, right, who bring Christianity as a moral imperative to other nations, but that's also comes with European technologies and factories and European assumptions about the world. And so civilization is one of the justifications for the conquest and colonization, say, of places like Africa. So by the time of, now, one of the ironies is that slave trade by 1880, when the scramble for Africa begins, is largely over. But then the justification for the entire conquest of Africa and attempted colonization of Africa becomes, okay, this is a inferior people that must be brought up to civilization. So now Europe will, now of course that's sort of the justification for it, but really let's not forget those original causes: economics, military control, nationalistic competition inside Europe for colonies. So let's not forget that this becomes sort of the ideological justification for the conquest. I urge you to read. I've assigned a excerpt from Michael Adas's "Machines as a Measure of Men." I urge you to read that. We're going to read 2 chapters of that to get a sense of, in a more granular way, how Europeans came to connect their technological achievements or technological advantages into racist assumptions in colonization. So we'll see that, and we'll see when we get to the World War I chapter. We'll see how a lot of those assumptions collapse in the brutality of the First World War. Here's a chart, for instance, a chart of supposedly the races of mankind. Notice the centrality of, I believe that's a Scotsman in the center, and the sort of classification of peoples depending upon. There's no actual hierarchy here, aside from the fact that Europeans tend to have bigger heads, but part of that is written into the assumptions, and then you see people sort of classified into different geographic regions, but also the assumption being that peoples not in the center are more inferior than those in the center. I've already talked about this, and so I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Sometimes have duplicate information on these slides. I apologize. That there's this racial logic of colonialism, is that racism, as I said, racism comes from its association with slavery, and that race is really a social reality, a folk idea. In the center here, I'll discuss briefly. For instance, now I'm rewinding, and I apologize for that. But if we look at a case study, Virginia in between 1600 and 1705, when slaves are first brought to Virginia on a Dutch trader in 1619, which, by the way, is 400 years to the date of this particular narration, that there is not really a fixed and fast association of Africa with slaves. And slaves in Virginia actually have some degree of legal recourse throughout the 17th century. By 1705, the laws regarding slavery have become quite draconian, and they get worse, all the way into the 19th century as they continually become associated with color in the American context. And so this is also happening in the European mind, of course. And really, we must understand that this science that comes up in the 19th century, not only of social Darwinism, but these assumptions of inferiority, it's pseudoscience. There's no basis for it. There are bases for Darwinian evolution, but social Darwinism is essentially a pseudoscience. And it becomes the myopic blinders that Europeans see the rest of the world through, and really create a quite tragic form of superstition that results not only in the subjugation but also in the deaths of many, many people around the world during this period. So let's go to the actual path of some of these things that happen. Now we're out of the realm of the sort of vague causes, or not the vague causes, but the sort of larger causes of this colonization. Let's go to some of the specifics. We can start with, especially in the context of Africa, we can start with a particular conference. We can start with a particular day. We can start with a particular group of people sitting around a table deciding some of this. And notice you have here in this illustration, this table at the Berlin Conference in 1884, where you have the leaders of Europe sitting around this table, and look in the center is this depiction of a Native African looking out from behind shrubbery to sort of peek in at this. Well, this conference this Berlin Conference, partially called by the King of Belgium, Leopold II, uh, although Belgium obtained independence in 1830, they they instituted a kingship, and Leopold II, very interesting individual. He called all. Now remember, Belgium's a very small country in relation to the other countries in Europe. Not certainly not as powerful. Has great location next to the Netherlands, and between the Netherlands and France. So strategic in many ways. But Leopold called together all European leaders and said, "Look, Africa is going to be colonized." The assumption was that Europe was going to colonize Africa in one way or another, and that this scramble, it was not called that, but this kind of carving up of the African continent between different European powers should be made orderly. Leopold's thought, which had some basis in, I guess, a sort of sinister practicality, was that if European nations fought over African colonies, that would bring war back home to Europe. That would destroy Europe, this competition. Wars that took place over particular areas of Africa would then cascade back into Europe. This is totally logical assumption based on the cold calculations of European conquest at the time. Now, Leopold characterized it. He calls this meeting. Many of these leaders array around this table at the Berlin Conference, and he characterizes this as a noble project on the behalf of these peoples, these supposedly inferior peoples, these supposedly socially Darwinian inferior peoples around the world. And he says, to open to civilization the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness which hangs over entire peoples is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this century of progress. And just in that quote, you can see many of the assumptions, right? Civilization, the only part of the globe which it has not yet penetrated, right? To open to civilization, European civilization, to pierce the darkness. Notice the use of color, right? To pierce the darkness. Supposedly, it was often called darkest Africa, right? Not only to refer to the color of the skin of many of the people who lived there, but also the kind of this supposed veil of ignorance that existed over Africa, which hangs over entire peoples, is, I dare say, a crusade. Notice in there the use of the Christian term crusade. And you have the European goals was to maintain this balance of power, and to have a united front against any other colonial powers that might try to muscle in. In seeing it this way, from this kind of abysmally small part of the Eurasian continent, I've used the term European continent. By the way, Europe is not a continent, but I'm not going to get into that debate right now, but you can go Google it. That these colonies are actually used as chits. So, for instance, they can be traded between different European powers as well. So they capture particular colonies, and then they in an orderly way, they kind of use them as if they were on some sort of risk board or on some sort of gaming table. Remember also that these colonies then can also be turned into, by these European powers, military labor forces. And one of the great untold stories of World War I is the number of Africans, for instance, that are brought back to Europe to fight in World War I and who die in the fields of Europe. But so colonies can be this military labor force. They can be also used to create militaries within these colonies. And of course, Leopold characterizes this as sort of a humanitarian mission. Well, there are many European colonies to talk about in Europe, but let's start with the Belgian Congo. Here you have King Leopold, the second at the top. and I warn you, some of this is quite brutal. Belgium obtains its independence in 1830, as I said before, largely in a revolution basically inspired by the American Revolution as well as the French Revolution. But it's quite more orderly than the French Revolution. In any case, he founds the International African Society. I already said this quote. I guess I shouldn't have repeated it. Anyway, he hires Henry Stanley, this African sort of explorer, to go to Africa and sort of scout it out. And he hires him. He sends him down to the Congo, which Congo, I don't have a map of it here, but you can go back to the earlier map. It was really the largest area in the center of Africa. It was the one that was most inaccessible for Europeans to get to. Um, you had to follow the Congo River. You had to follow it up, and to get into the interior, there's tremendous natural resources. There's still tremendous natural resources there today, and it's a vast area. And Leopold II, Belgium, knowing that he's from a relatively small country, has this project to capture and control this particular area. Here it is as characterized by Stanley. As yet, the Congo Basin is a blank, a fruitless waste, a desolate and unproductive area. All of this is completely bonkers and untrue. It has been our purpose to fill this blank with life, to redeem this waste, to plant and sow, that the dark man may gather, to vivify the wide, wild lands so long forgotten by Europe. You're getting a sense of the arrogance and also idiocy of this idea that peoples there need European civilization in the sense of how Europeans see it. In any case, what occurs is that this vast area becomes something known as the Congo Free State, a very ironic term, and Belgium. Well, not Belgium. Excuse me, that's wrong. The entire Congo Free State, although it's it's going to be called the Belgian Congo. It's only called the Belgian Congo later because as the Congo Free State, it is entirely owned by King Leopold II. This is a region which is, because he is the king, he has direct control over this entire area. It's not really part of Belgium, and this has to do with the nature of the Belgian government. So King Leopold II effectively, I guess in his imagination or I guess in practicality, owns and profits from everything that goes on in that colony. He proceeds to plant and create rubber plantations all throughout the Congo, just to give you a sense of how rubber is harvested or how rubber is made, how these plantations, how this natural resource is collected. You would have to harvest this latex from trees, and actually the latex would be put over the arms of those who are harvesting it. It actually would often burn, and as it was taken off, it often like ripped the hair and skin off of people who were harvesting it. It's really a quite brutal process. And remember, this is the Congo Free State is creating these rubber plantations just at the time of the rise of the automobile and the bicycle and the huge demand for rubber. There's also tons of different uses for rubber in many different industrial processes. And so the Congo Free State is essentially turned into largely one of its primary exports is going to be this rubber for Belgium to dominate. Very labor intensive. It's a very labor intensive collection process. The people of the Congo, the people that live there, effectively are forced to become a basically a slave labor force for King Leopold II. Armed mercenaries from largely native Congolese are hired to become essentially the overseers for this series of large rubber plantations, and they are hired and they are told they must fulfill a quota. They must make sure that X amount of rubber comes in all the time, and these armed mercenaries are sent to the interior. They terrorize villages. They basically command that entire villages collect a certain amount of rubber. If a certain village does not collect a certain amount of rubber, then various terror tactics are used against the people. Torture and rape were very common in these armed mercenaries sort of going into the interior and at the behest of King Leopold II, um, and the regime that's created, those armed mercenaries go into the interior and are basically terrorize this population into collecting as much rubber in this terrible process as possible. Now, this is terrible enough without what happens, how this starts to develop. One of the ways in which armed mercenaries would prove that they had gone into a particular area and demanded this amount of rubber, they would go back to their functionaries to prove that they'd gone in and that they had um, taught the people a lesson in fulfilling their quota in the future, was that they would cut the hands off of um, children and others and show them to these overseers as proof that they had, laid down the law about how much rubber needed to be collected. As a result of that use of these hands that were brought back, there was actually a trade in hands that develops. The hands actually acquire some sort of monetary or currency type value because they could be shown to, you bring them back to the functionary who's presiding over this colony and the functionary that's proof of something, and they become monetary use. In fact, this entire process is, if you want to read a novelization of this terrible, almost brutally horrible situation, you can read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is largely based on this colony. Heart of Darkness, of course, was later made into the Vietnam War film Apocalypse Now, which so it follows a certain similar trajectory. In any case, it's estimated today that because of this, because of King Leopold's control of the colony and the abuses that took place with the Congolese people during this period of time, that the estimates range from about 8 million to 10 million dead. Not directly killed through but killed through just the total debasement of the people in the Congo through war and subjugation and disease. And so this is really one of the most tragic and large-scale deaths, large-scale events of terror in human history. And you've probably never heard of it. Most people have never heard of what happened in the Congo. And it's just a story about European conquest and imperialism that needs to be told. And needs to be understood as a symptom of a larger process that was occurring at the time. This is one of the most brutal examples of that process, but this was going on in many other places. And this is just Belgium. This is just the Belgian manifestation of this. Continue on. Excuse me. I'm going to continue on. Let's talk about Germany. Now, Germany is a little different of a case in that, as we've talked about before, Germany was a rather late comer to European nationhood, and quite quickly. Remember, Germany was a pretty militaristic nation when it began. That militarism was kind of part of the way that Germany unified. It was something that the German leadership took very seriously in terms of appearing to be these military leaders in a domestic sense. Well, so Germany quickly wants colonies. They want colonies just like France and England seem bent on, and so they get into this scramble for Africa as well. There's a number of different regions in this that we could talk about in relation to Germany, but we're going to talk about Germany, East Africa, because it's one of the most interesting. And it's there's a lot of ways in which understanding what happens in Germany, East Africa helps us understand Adolf Hitler and Germany between the wars. I'm going to go over this real briefly because I went through this in the first from the first lesson. But remember, unification in 1871 creates this powerful nationalistic state in Germany. Remember, it's an autocratic state with a pretty energetic but largely toothless Reichstag. So it has a parliament, but they really can't. They really don't have a lot of power to to affect anything or to prove anything. They have some power over the purse, but a lot of their power emanates from the leaders such as um, that the German state was also kind of personality driven. And very early on, and this says a lot about, might go to some way of explaining about the cultural reasons to the rise of Hitler. But very early on, the leader of Germany, in many ways, felt that he embodied the entire German state. So you already had this kind of cult of personality that involved, centered around the German leadership. There's a lot of national pride. You had an increasing population in Germany. Um, Germany industrializes very rapidly. But remember, Germany is a nation in the center of Europe, fears being surrounded. And so there is in the sort of German political consciousness this desire to expand. Obviously, that expansion has to go on the European continent, either into Eastern Europe, into Poland, or west into France, um, or south into Italy, or north, or wherever. So there's a limited range of how far Germany can go, as we will see in World War II. The Nazi regime tries to take over all of Europe. But in this late 19th century context, this fear of being surrounded creates even perhaps more of a desire for colonies. There's almost a freneticism that goes to getting colonies in Africa, not only to compete against other European nations, but also with an eye towards increasing German zones that can be colonized, where the German people can go. So if you have this increasing population, there's this desire to sort of put them somewhere, and remember, there's going to be a term that Hitler is going to use in the 1930s known as Lebensraum, Lebensraum, which refers to living space. And it's the notion that Hitler espouses that Germany needs more living space, needs more people, needs more lands for its people, and starts to see that in Poland. Well, at the time before that, Germany saw Africa as a place for this Lebensraum, for this living space. So, and Germany has all of these imperial ambitions. So, and how does Africa fit into this? Well, one of the regions that Africa goes to is the rather difficult to access African Great Lakes region in East Africa. You can see it here on this old map, German East Africa. Notice Zanzibar off the coast. Notice this proximity to. Remember, we're going to talk about the British colonization of the central part of Africa. Well, this area in German East Africa is where they go. Today, parts of it are the nations of Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda. Well, how does Germany grab this area? And this is interesting, because this is partially the way that a lot of these European powers came into control of these particular areas. There's a man named Carl Peters who you see in this picture, dressed up kind of as an American cowboy. And there's a fascinating connection between German adulation of the American cowboy. In fact, one of the most popular writers in Germany is this writer named, at the beginning of the 20th century, was this writer Karl May, who would write these sort of stories about American cowboys fighting against Native Americans, and was always about the superior cowboy sort of defeating Native Americans, and that this kind of sort of fetishization of the Native American context, in the context of Native Americans being pushed aside and their land being taken over by Europeans coming in, was something which was very prominent in the German consciousness, not only through Karl May's books, but also through the actions of people like Carl Peters. So Carl Peters goes down. He goes and visits various chieftains, various supposed leaders of various groups in this area of what would become German East Africa, and signs these agreements. These agreements are just pieces of paper. Whether these are really the leaders that that have any control over the people or not. Remember, this is also something that Europe, that the English did and others did when they encountered Native Americans in North and South America, was that you'd sign a treaty with somebody who would say, "Hey, yeah, I'm the leader," and sign a treaty and give them something. They would not be the leader, and then that piece of paper would be used to justify the sort of obtaining of all of the land of Native Americans that lived there. So these agreements were just pieces of paper. But he takes these pieces of paper, he goes back to Germany, he says, "Look what I've gotten. I have this. I'm I'm we can have control of this continent. Um, let's send people down." Um, the German government basically helps with a rebellion that Karl Peters um, kind of institutes or foments there. The German government then sends down supporters to help Peters and his basically renegade mercenary project. Peters comes home as his conquering hero, and Germany takes it over. So it really is like one man goes down, kind of an oddball, goes down, signs these various agreements, brings them back to Germany, starts to set up a little colony, and German government comes in and helps out and takes military control of the area. Well, in 1908, for instance, there are rebellions against the Germans because the Germans now are setting up plantations and to a certain extent forcing the natives that live there to grow cotton. Um, and I pause because there's a huge story about how cotton is responsible for the expansion of the westward expansion of the United States through the growing of cotton and cotton-based slavery that extends all the way into Texas and foments the Mexican War. Anyway, um, and cotton is just a really terrible crop, and you can't eat it. So many of these natives are forced into growing cotton. There's a rebellion in 1908 and 1913. That rebellion's put down. 1913, you have 882 German settlers. It's a pretty specific number. 882 German settlers with 70,000 locals working plantations. I mean, this is roughly similar to the ratios that you had, say, in Haiti prior to the revolution in Haiti at the beginning of the 18th century, where you had roughly similar numbers, much larger numbers of ratios of French settlers, sort of colonial French population that controlled hundreds of thousands of African slaves. Well, remember, the end of this story is that Germany loses this colony to Britain and Belgium after World War One. The colony gets carved up between the two. The Rwandan part kind of goes to Belgium, and Germany loses this colony. But what's instructive about it is to show, first of all, how you have this kind of oddball adventurer who goes down and kind of inspires the people to have, and then the military leadership of Germany sees a opportunity to take over this area and create a colony. So this kind of comes about in this kind of odd way right after German unification, and also see how the colony is turned into, much in the same way that the Belgian Congo was turned into, essentially a forced labor plantation for this aspiring European colonial power. It's also very short lived. So this story is kind of over, but here, at least in terms of German East Africa, but that dream of controlling colonies around the world is going to certainly live on after the defeat of Germany, and it's going to be a dream of the Third Reich. So we will revisit that when we talk about the rise of Hitler and the rise of Nazism and the rise of fascism in general in Europe. I want to go to Ethiopia. If you remember before, I noted that Ethiopia was one of the only nations up until the First World War that remained independent, aside from Liberia. And this gives a story of an attempted European takeover and a failed one. Um, Ethiopia, uh, unlike unlike West Africa, had a very large Christian population. This was a very ancient Christian population, and still does today. Coptic Christianity, um, and it's a So Ethiopia was a region that was not. It's also in the interior, so slavery was not as common. In the Also slavery just wasn't as common in East Africa. So um, early on, after Italian unification, Italy starts to look for colonies as well. They go to the coast of Libya. They go to what is today Libya. They take over some areas there, and then they start to look at Ethiopia. Um, and this is a situation in the late 19th century. We're talking about 1895, 1896. Italy tries to take over Ethiopia. Um, and Italy signs this agreement with Menelik, the king of Ethiopia, and there's this dispute. So Italy attempts to take it over with an invasion of Italian troops. This is one of the first hints to Europe that this colonial project is going to be rather short-lived, or is actually going to is not something that Europeans should assume based on social Darwinism and based on their ideas of superiority and their ideas of bringing civilization and their ideas of, the power of their weaponry, that this is going to work. Happens in this defeat because the Ethiopians, a massive Ethiopian army, um, fights the Italians who have superior weaponry, but just the masses of Ethiopians who are in a very actually quite well organized army. They defeat the Italian army and kill over 15,000 Italian soldiers. Now, the sequel to this story comes after in the interwar period, in the period between World War I and World War II, in which Italy does invade Ethiopia in 1935, largely through the added technology of air power through Mussolini. But that also is, as you might imagine, a very short-lived conquest because that starts in 1935 and is certainly over by 1945. So Ethiopia is a good example of a African nation that actually repulses European colonialism and imperialism. Um, Eventually falls to it, at least in the 1930s and early 40s, but is a sense that this there is going to be a time where this entire colonial and imperial project, specifically in Africa, is going to be reversed. All right, so I titled this slide. Now we're going to move to. We've talked about briefly. We've talked about Belgium. We've talked about Germany. We've talked about Italy. Now let's talk about one of the elephants in the room of European colonialism and colonization. Um, Not really, arguably, the most powerful European power in the 19th century was the British Empire by far. I showed you a map earlier of British sort of expansive control over the entire planet. The British Empire was extremely powerful, even after the loss of uh, colonies in North America. But let's go back. Let's go all the way back to 1588. Yeah, I know the course starts in 1914, and I'm talking about 1588, but just bear with me. The date at which British power starts to ascend and is usually seen as the sort of beginning point of European colonialism, imperialism, expansion, etc., is in 1588. 1588. Remember, Spain is really the first European power to take over large swaths of South America and Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean and other places. Well, Spain was hugely powerful throughout most of the 16th century. And in 1588, the Spanish send an armada to England. Most people know this story in one guise or form. They send an armada to England to defeat them. That armada is almost decimated, partially through English ingenuity, but also through weather. And the Spanish armada is defeated. This is often seen as the crossing point between European dominance of the planet as a colonial power and Spanish decline. So the Spanish go through a long, slow decline from 1588. The Spanish Empire, I mean, they still have control over large areas such as the Philippines and large areas in Mexico and South America. But from 1588, you can sort of see this line that goes all the way basically to 1898, when the United States essentially defeats the Spanish in the Spanish-American War and takes over three of the last largest places that the Spanish controlled, which were the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Those areas which were formerly part of the Spanish Empire and then devolve and become part of the American Empire. So Spain is sort of defeated. Britain is moving up. Between 1620 and 1776, a lot of English attention is centered on North America. Of course, in 1776, start of the Revolutionary War, and you have the loss of that large colony. But Britain is still very powerful, has huge colonies in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and increasingly is establishing control over India. Why does now I want to examine here, get away from how they're colonizing, but why does England? Why is England one of the first places where the Industrial Revolution happens? And this is an interesting story because the Britain really engages in this second wave of empire building in the 19th century, almost leads it, largely because the Industrial Revolution really first happens in England. The Why does it happen in England as opposed to France? This is often referred to as simplistically as the difference between sort of a Baconian idea of the application of science or scientific discovery after the scientific revolution and the Cartesian application of it. For instance, in England, and this is really simplistic, but the French, some historians identify that the French looked at finding knowledge really more for knowledge's sake and sort of more in the zone of theory, and that the British were more concerned, even the English were more concerned even from the beginning with the application of science, the technological application of science, so that useful knowledge. So, and this goes to a lot of the story, but science and technology are not necessarily joined. You can do science and just continue to do science in the realm of the discovery of knowledge, which is associated more with the Cartesian idea, as opposed to the, hey, let's do science to try to find out how to make a better water wheel, or hey, let's do science to find out a way to make something better work. And so the English sort of branch of the scientific revolution starts to look at ways to more technological applications of this. This is good for England also because England is a particularly good, small, tightly kind of organized island. Remember, it's also relatively impregnable from outside powers invading because it is an island, and that it has a lot of the ingredients that make the industrial explosion that occurs at the end of the 18th century in England possible. First of all, it's got relatively small size, so it doesn't take long to get the resources that you need to power this revolution to the places that you need it, to urban centers. You have a growing population that can be employed in many of these new factories. Agriculture is quite good. It's self-sufficient in terms of agriculture, and it's got an empire that can bring in raw materials. If you look at this particular map to the right, you'll notice the what we have identified here are coal fields and also textile centers. Notice that you have a large coal deposits. You have miners who are extracting that coal. That coal can then be used to fire fire these steam engines which are being constructed, and you also have navigable rivers, and so these steam engines drive these textile centers. Everything's really close together, and so you don't need to you have a lot of geographic advantages in England that made the Industrial Revolution possible. Well, so how does the empire grow? So in the 18th century, United Kingdom, not only, even after losing North America, really expands into Ireland, Canada, India, South Africa, um, and and then in the late 19th century, you see it expand even further in the scramble for Africa, and then also the decaying and sort of um, collapsing Ottoman Empire. Um, the real key to a lot of this, just as the key to U.S. dominance, military dominance across the planet today, is the U.S. air power. In the 19th century, it was British naval power. The British had one of the most advanced navies in the world, one of the most powerful navies in the world, and really their dominance had a lot to do with the power of their navy. Um, so one of the reasons why we see that the British Empire declines is by the end of the 19th century, this industrial revolution has moved to other nations, and these other nations are then vying with the British for power. So, although the industrial revolution kind of starts in England and then is able to fuel British expansion across the planet, that quickly they develop a lot of rivals. The United States has its own industrial revolution really in the 1820s and 1830s that creates a huge boom in U.S. power. This also happens with Germany, the unification of Germany, and also the rapid industrialization of Germany. The France is not that far behind England in the 19th century, and then certainly Russia rapidly industrializes after the 1870s and 1880s, and we'll talk about that in a later lesson. Um, Here, for instance, all these areas in pink are part of the British Empire. There's a whole really map of this. But anyway, I want to start by talking, though, not about Africa in relation to England, but talking about Ireland. And the reason why is because North America and the United States and North American colonies are not a really good example to talk about as a typical way that Britain expands. But let's look at Ireland as an example. Because remember, Ireland's right off the coast of England. It is an area which did not have the kind of power that England had early on, and that we're going to see that England starts to colonize and try to control Ireland as a colony quite early on. So if you look at what happens to Ireland from between, say, the 1500s and the early 20th century, you can get a sense of what not only England is doing in other in Africa and in India and elsewhere, but you can also see what other European powers who then, to a certain extent, emulate Britain are doing. Mid 19th century, Ireland was in a really terrible state. In fact, the way that, for instance, Haiti is often looked at today as a often unfairly as a sort of collapsed state in many ways, is a very disorganized state, very poor, full of corruption, etc. Mid 19th century Ireland, you can kind of be imagined like that. Immense poverty in Ireland. The Irish people, most of the raw materials and the goods and the best food to come out of Ireland was sucked out and taken to England. This is where England is growing most of its food and extracting it. The Irish people generally subsist mostly on potatoes, which was really, I mean, remember, there's no potatoes in Ireland or elsewhere, anywhere in Europe before 1492, because potatoes come from Peru. There were no potatoes anywhere, so the Irish are eating basically this one crop because it's very inexpensive and it's the one thing that they subsist on. It's high in nutrients, but you can't subsist on one crop, so they have basically one crop that they're eating. Um, British English assumptions concerning the Irish were it's weird to call them racist because if we associate these racial ideas with color, but the the English looked at the Irish very much as they looked at them in the same way that many other European peoples were looking at, say, Africans and Asians as inferior. The British looked at the Irish as inferior and basically blamed them for their colonial condition. they had these assumptions about their character and about their religion. They assumed they were Catholic, and they were also backwards that way. So there were a whole series of assumptions which of Irish inferiority, um, which the English had. Um, the In 1845, I'll give you a sense of one of the this is one of these terrible narratives. In 1845, a fungus starts appearing on potatoes first in northern France, I believe, and it spreads. It spreads to Ireland, where there's these huge potato crops. Remember, this is the crop that the Irish are subsisting on, and they're sending most of their butter and most of their cheese and most of their beef and all of their more high-priced goods. They're sending. It's all being extracted by the British, who have control over the island. In 1845, this famine begins because this fungus starts affecting these potatoes. When the Irish will pull the potatoes out of the ground, they'll basically turn to jelly. I mean, it's almost disgusting. And the stink of these rotting potatoes, the potatoes are actually rotting in the ground. Nobody really knows why it's happening. I say it's a fungus, but this is something that was not known at the time. And they didn't know why it was happening. It was just happening. And in 1845, the Irish population is 8.6 million people. It's a pretty crowded place. I had the privilege of being able to go to Ireland recently, and you go around and you realize that this was a much more populated island than it is now. In fact, in 2018, the Irish population of the entire island is now 6.9 million. So it's 1.7 million less than it was in 1845, which sort of flies in the face of our assumptions concerning population growth around the world. The population of Ireland has actually decreased. You can actually wander around Ireland and still find abandoned places from the famine. This famine hits the English on principle refuse to give direct aid to the Irish people. They believe it's kind of their situation is kind of their fault. They also believe that it will upset markets and it will make the Irish dependent on aid. It will make them a dependent people and will not give them the thrift and kind of the kind of moxie to get out of their situation, which is absolutely absurd. And so they actually at first refused to give direct aid as in terms of setting up food kitchens and things like that to combat this famine. So they sort of just sit back, the British authorities, um, and let essentially sort of acquiesce to the deaths of basically 1 million people. 1 million Irish starve during the potato famine, and 2 million emigrate. The massive numbers of Irish that come into the United States in the mid 19th century, right before the Civil War, many of whom fight in the Civil War, is mostly occasioned by this famine. So uh, this here's a quote from one of the leaders of England at the time, Trevelyan, on Ireland. The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. And I show that mainly to give you a sense of the attitudes that many Europeans had in the 19th century towards the rest of the world. And so they didn't just have to be their attitudes, their sort of racist, social Darwinist attitudes that they had towards Africans and Asians. They also had these sort of attitudes towards peoples right off their coast in Ireland. And that these attitudes, this sort of survival of the fittest attitude, is something which is driving European assumptions about the effects of colonization and imperialism. It's also stoking a great deal of anger at Europe from all over the planet, and still does today. So, in any case, I'll go through this quickly about the British sort of establishment of colonial control in Africa. A lot of it starts with the building of the Suez Canal, which also helped open Africa to colonization, colonialism, imperialism by other European powers. But this Suez Canal was built in 1875 with British and French sort of cooperation. Pay attention to this because we're going to have a Suez crisis in the 1950s, which is going to be a vital period of point of contention during the Cold War, and also has huge implications for the future of the Middle East. But we'll talk about that later. Between 1882 and 1914, um, while Egypt at the time is supposed to really be autonomous as a sort of an autonomous nation inside of the Ottoman Empire, it's really controlled by England under something which is sometimes referred to as the Veiled Protectorate. So it's a protectorate. It's really a de facto protectorate. The British have their warships. They kind of control it, but there's no actual direct administration, or at least no actual direct administration on paper. And so that Veiled Protectorate of British control of Egypt really extends from about 1882 to, look at that, 1914 to World War One. And they call this, you see here, this cartoon of I believe that's Henry Stanley. I should probably know my pictures a little better. Straddling the African continent with one foot on the Cape, meaning the Cape of Good Hope, or the Cape of the area of South Africa, and one foot in Egypt, and that sort of under his legs is this vast expanse of British control, of which is also this dream of constructing a railway to sort of control this. Here we're back to this map. So and the last thing I want to talk about in terms of British control of and sort of European imperialism in Africa in particular, and more widely in the rest of the world. And again, as I said, we're going to talk later about Asia and the Indian subcontinent in other lessons. But to also understand the reasons, the effect of this colonialism, let's look at South Africa, because South Africa is vitally important to understanding a lot of this. I think if you remember back to my introductory part, Mohandas Gandhi, Gandhi lives in South Africa for a time and first comes up with a lot of his ideas about Indian independence in South Africa as a lawyer. So South Africa is kind of central not only to the history of Europe and the history of the British Empire, but it's certainly it's important to understanding world history in its own right. It's also important to understanding United States history. So we'll get into that in a second. So South Africa was first had some of the first settlers to come to South Africa were not English; they're actually Dutch. The Boers come to South Africa in the early part of the 19th century and start to create farms there. It's not a situation of colonial control by the Dutch. It's somewhat a degree of settlement. And so, but by the end of the 19th century, as the British are increasing their control over and have really consolidated their control over India, as they come around, remember first after they carve the Suez Canal, they have a more direct route to India. But before that, they sort of take control of this region of South Africa, the Cape. They take control of it in order to be sort of this place, this sort of stop on the journey to India. So they take control of this vast swath of the southern part of the African continent. Now you have this large European population that's growing, that's living there and settling, which is not what's occurring everywhere, that Europeans are settling or coming and colonizing or taking colonial control. You have this large European population. You also have a huge African worker population, because remember, most of the population is, of course, Native African. You have many different peoples that live. South Africa is not one South African people. There's many different peoples, as you can see from this map here of on the right, of the different peoples that live in these different areas. Well, this is a map of the different homelands, okay, which roughly and quite inaccurately approximate where these particular peoples live, but these are homelands, and we'll talk about these in a second. So this quite complicated situation with Dutch settlers and then the English and then this large African worker population, race quickly becomes a major facet of life in South Africa. By the early 20th century, what's become ingrained in South Africa is this notion that the Europeans are in control of this area, or the British are in control, the English are in control, later in independent South Africa is in control, but that the peoples, the various African peoples and tribal peoples, quote unquote, are only allowed to live in their particular homeland, and that to leave their homeland, they must have basically like a passport to travel around. So they're basically segregated. A lot of this system is actually predicated upon the the system in the American South of segregation. So the two systems kind of go hand in hand, apartheid and southern segregation in facilities across the American South. Um, Sort of central to the approach in Africa in general, but also in this notion of creating these homelands for these native peoples, which seems very similar to the American context with Native Americans on reservations, is the that these are being called tribes. You must remember that before, Africa is vast. These different peoples saw themselves as kingdoms. They saw themselves as living in kingdoms. You know, there were various ethnic peoples that lived in various conglomerations, but they also lived in kingdoms. They saw themselves as kings, and you see this diminution of Africans being called living in kingdoms from, say, the 16th and 17th century, and then by the 19th century, they're only referred to as tribes and tribal people. So there's this, when we talk about tribes, it's really an inaccurate almost way of thinking about their level of political development, when in fact they were living in kingdoms, and Europeans were calling them as such. Quite early on, and then that as this exploitation developed over hundreds of years, they devolved into being called tribes, and then peoples who were sort of segregated and sort of herded onto these into these homelands. In any case, the South African example gives you a certain extent of the racial characteristics of what's going on during this period of colonialism, imperialism. It also gives you a sense of the complicated nature of it, with the sort of jockeying control between the English and the Dutch, and what we have here is you have, in many ways, the English Empire, this dream of completing it from Cairo to South Africa, is part and parcel of the larger project of European imperialism before World War One. Now, I haven't talked about everything that could possibly be talked about. I've talked about a lot. Certainly haven't covered India. Certainly haven't covered Southeast Asia. Certainly haven't covered interior politics and domestic politics that are taking place in Europe. But I'll let this talk stand to introduce and talk about the what's going on in terms of colonialism, imperialism, and this competition between European powers for control of large areas of the Earth's surface prior to World War One. What we're going to talk about when we get into actually talking about the Great War in the next lesson is not only the beginning of the collapse of this system, but the extraction of peoples from these areas to come into Europe to fight. The reason why World War One, remember, first it's called the Great War, and later it's called World War One, is because of this colonial expansion. This war, World War One, is fought all over the world. It's fought with all of the world's peoples. And because it comes after the era of this large era of imperialism and colonialism from Europe, that involves the entire planet. And World War One will be really I say high watermark, but that gives it some sort of valorization, the high watermark of European colonial control of the planet. And what we will see in a quite dramatic and the more I teach it, the more unimaginable fashion of the rapid collapse of this. We can say we live in the post-World War II era today. We can say Europe is a post-World War II construction of, if you look at Europe today, but really it's a post-World War I construction. And 1914, as we finally get to the date of which this course is supposed to begin, 1914 is really the date that we must begin seeing Europe after this period of dominance. And how does Europe either adjust? How do these European nations adjust to this new reality of not being the center of the control of the world? What kind of decisions do they make? How does Europe change after that? That's really part of the subject of this course. We're certainly going to look quite intensely. Once we get to 1914, we look at the Great War itself. We're also going to look at the what we call the interwar period, and then World War II, and then the post World War II period. But I did want to give these first three lessons as a way of showing the progression and the reasons for World War One, and the reasons for how dramatic the collapse of Europe is in 1914 and afterwards. This is not to say that European control and European dominance and European power disappears. That's obviously not the case, but we'll see how it changes to a great degree and adapts to this new reality of in a much more complex world in what we call contemporary Europe. So I thank you, and I will see you in the next